Hey all. Yeah, Carl here. Just, yeah, figured we'd get a video out this week because it's somewhat important, potentially. And yeah, so the plan, yeah, I know, I guess, yeah, no, okay, focused. Right, so the intention is to discuss, at least to some degree, um, the levels of complete ridiculousness that tech stuff is getting to, just in general, and a level of some frustrations over that, right? It's, yeah, I don't know, and kind of frustratingly bad at this point in many ways. So much of it is frustratingly bad and irritating, right? Because Steam have apparently, yeah, I mean, what kicked this off, right, is that Steam have decided that not only are they going to, it used to be the thing that was an option, right? You could ask Steam on a Linux launch to compatibility mode Windows only get games that didn't have Linux support natively to run through Proton as an emulator on for Windows, and that's a cool bit of and a nice little thing that if you're happy running an emulator, right, and having Steam run an emulator for you and happy playing a video game through that, then great, right? It's an option that's available to you and open to you. Now, of course, like, it's not how we would recommend setting that up, but it's an option that was theoretically at least open to you, right? But the it has stopped being just an option and has become just the way Steam does things now, which is a problem, right? Because it's removed optionality and choice, and it's no longer clear whether games that do have native Linux support will even be run through that or will be emulated. And there's no way of telling which games are going to be emulated in the library either, because what used to be the very sensible, oh yeah, just click the box and it will only show you Linux games, no longer works. It shows you every single game it thinks it can run through an emulator as well. And you can't turn the emulator off in any way, and you can't refilter for it, which effectively makes the Steam no longer a usable game launching system on Linux if you do not want to run an emulator, which we do not, right? If we wanted to have access to Windows things, we would have purchased the Windows license with our computer. But we don't want access to Windows things enough to, or we would set up an emulator ourselves, right? We'd get an emulator running and run things through the emulator that we know is running stably and that we've got full control over, right? Because we installed it directly ourselves, we know which emulator it is, we know what it's doing and how it's doing it, right? This now has, so that's all been removed, which is, of course, a problem, right? Because it's effectively stripped away all that control and choice and made it impossible to properly browse through your library to tell what is actually, a reasonable choice to load and which ones will effectively force through an emulator. Which, like, emulators can work and can work reasonably stably, but Windows is often difficult to emulate in a way that, those of you familiar with emulation for things like SNESes and the like might go, yeah, but emulation isn't that bad, emulation works well. And it does for things like that, where, it's known hardware that the entirety of the specs are out for, right? And are effectively public knowledge to anyone that wants to find them, right? And everything that you need to know how it runs a game and all of that is all effectively public knowledge, to at least to anyone who wants to find it, right? Which makes them very runnable, right? And so those are relatively easy to emulate stably because you know exactly what you're emulating, and they need far less computing power, right? Which means that you can afford the significant increase in inefficiencies on computing that are required for emulation, right? Emulation is always less efficient than running something natively in terms of computing requirements. But of course, when you're taking a modern computer and emulating something like an SNES, the difference in raw computing power available is so absurd that efficiency really doesn't matter, right? And that's simply not true for moving from, a modern Linux box to a modern Windows box, right? That loss of efficiency suddenly becomes incredibly important. And of course, you add to that, right, the fact that Windows is far more complicated to emulate than something like an SNES, and emulation, it becomes almost inherently unstable and less reliable, right? And so, especially if if you're not the one in full control over it then, and as the end user, right, it's going through a third-party platform, right, that becomes a serious issue, because you really do need to be able to have that level of control, right? You need that control, and that's just gone, right? So it just doesn't work anywhere near as well as what they want, I think. And, I get it for, like, it being a thing that's available is probably good, right? Especially for, things like Steam Deck, right? Great. Cool. It's brilliant, it's available for things like Steam Deck, but it should not be uncheckable box, right? It should be an option that's available to you, right? But at the very least, you need to be able to filter through your library to things that are, actually in your, the ones that don't require native support. And that doesn't exist, which makes it, for all intents and purposes, has made Steam unusable, as far as we're concerned, right? Because we do not want an emulator running, right? If we were going to run an emulator, we would do it very deliberately and carefully with specific choices, by making every single decision along the path ourselves, right? And because we would want it to be as stable and reliable as we could get it, and that's not the way of doing that, right? And add to that the fact that Microsoft have now apparently decided that it doesn't matter what local laws are. If the US government asks for user data, they're going to just hand it over, right? And while that obviously doesn't directly affect us because we're not using any Microsoft products, at least personally, right? Our personal life does not include any Microsoft products. That does, of course, still mean that depending on how the emulator is being done, and because, again, we are not the ones with choice over that emulator, we've got no way of... I mean, we're not the ones with decision-making over that. We can't then go through and double-check how it's running it to make sure that Microsoft's not getting any data, right? Because we do not trust Microsoft to not have embedded in their code, right, the things that make Windows run stably with data gathering, right? And so any Windows emulation might well, especially without being able to look through it ourselves, right? Right, if it's not something that we can definitionally trust effectively, it becomes completely unusable. And we can't definitionally trust it, right? Because we're not the ones looking, we've got no insight into it effectively at all, and that makes it unusable as far as we're concerned, right? At this stage. So it's effectively just become impossible to use Steam, right? And we would seriously recommend, if you have any private data that you do not want the US government getting hold of, shifting away from Microsoft use products altogether, if you can. Now, at the very least, the problem is, right, unless you're in the US, then they apparently don't care about local law at all on this, so I don't think there's any reasonable way to talk to local officials and local government, right, to get legalities changed on that, because they don't care about those, right? So that's not going to work. The only people who, maybe you can talk to Microsoft about it, but again, why would they care? Right? They're such a big company with such a market share lead that I don't think they're going to care, unless a lot of people kick up a lot of a stink, effectively, which means, right? But that's very unlikely to happen in the scale that would be required. So you probably just have to move away from Microsoft products if you want to keep your data safe. And that sucks. Like, don't get us wrong, we don't like Microsoft products. We don't use them, but for a lot of people, that is by far the more convenient option, right? It's the simpler option, it's the convenient option. we understand why people use Microsoft stuff. We use Microsoft for quite a while for things, right? Because it is simple and convenient. And that being removed as an option is, of course, a problem, regardless of anything else, right? I mean, it's not technically removed as a problem, but for practical purposes, for a privacy perspective, it is now removed as a problem. It is now removed as an option, right? If you care at all about your privacy, you cannot be using Microsoft products, regardless of where in the world you are, because the US government has access to all the data that Microsoft can gather from those products, right? Which, given that Microsoft offer things like facial ID for login if you've got a webcam, might well include things like biometrics, depending on what you've used, right? Or, email addresses, anything you've written in Microsoft Word, which, depending on what you're doing, might well include things that provide a level of political statement. If you've ever used Microsoft Edge for any web browsing, obviously anything that's happened on there, right? So on and so forth. So, there is nothing on this, right? And of course, this is all on top of the new age restriction laws on the internet, which don't work. They just make kids less safe on the internet. That's not how this works. It's not going to work. It's not going to help anyone. But, they're going to insist that somehow it will help, and they're wrong. It does not protect children. It does not do anything to help anyone. All it is doing is making the internet less safe, right? And providing random private companies with, your photo ID and biometric data to go along with it, right? It doesn't work. It just makes the internet less safe. It does not stop children from seeing adult content. It does not, right? It's not going to do that. All it's going to do is make the internet a worse place, a more dangerous place, right? And then, so most, of course, a lot of places are folding to these because they kind of have to, right? But the thing is, it's things like, people will say, oh yeah, no, Blue Sky is decentralized, Blue Sky is safe, right? But Blue Sky are folding to these. Blue Sky are, right, despite being quote-unquote decentralized, right, and apparently not, therefore, one of the, of course Facebook are going to comply, right? And of course Twitter's going to comply, right? They can't not, they've got too large a user base, right? They're too centralized, definitionally, to not comply with laws like that, right? To expect them to not comply is foolish, right? But it would sort of, theoretically, at least, given that Blue Sky like to market themselves as decentralized, right? And somewhat counterculture and, anti-authoritarian, as a platform, you would expect them not to fold, right? And yet they are also folding on these, which just proves that, they're not decentralized, right? It's not a decentralized platform because, the Fediverse is not folding to any of this, right? Actual, Mastodon and other Fediverse clients are not paying attention because they don't care, right? Because it doesn't matter. Because, it's so much harder to actually functionally shut it down because it's, so much of it is just the person running a server from their home. The policing is so much more difficult than it becomes effectively safe, right? It's not truly completely safe, of course, but, it's much harder to functionally shut it down and police it, right? And there's much less motivation to do so as well because the user base is much smaller, right? So, look, essentially what it becomes is that, essentially anywhere that's at all centralized is going to follow these rules, and is therefore going to become unusable if you care at all about protecting your identity and not having your photo ID available to literally anyone who wants it. Because that's how this works, is the moment you send it online, it's now available to anyone. I know that's not how it literally technically works, but for practical purposes, the moment something is online, it is public knowledge, right? And we don't know about you, but we certainly do not feel comfortable ever having our photo ID be public knowledge, right? That's not knowledge, that's not something we would ever want. And, I mean, if you're okay with your photo ID being public knowledge, then good for you, right? But, and you can keep, you can keep using those platforms and not hide your location so they're not checking those things, right? But the thing is because a lot of these laws, right, they don't even work, right? There are plenty of loopholes around them, and of course, the important thing is, right, the people that want a way around them are going to find a way around them. And that includes kids who want to still access that content are going to find a way around, right? They're going to keep finding ways around for the minors that want to find that content, and importantly, of course, the ways around that are likely to end up with them in less safe spaces, right? Because, like, is Twitter, for example, a good place to exist? No, of course not, right? Especially for a minor, but at all, right? Twitter is a miserable place to exist, right? But, like, or, you know, or Reddit, or any of these places, right? But, like, if you want, you know, as a minor, if you wanted adult content, those were options, right? At least to some degree, of course, right? And there are other options that are generally reasonably safe and are not going to get you groomed if you had access to them, right? And they now don't, which means that you're going to see more things like, you know, what's happened with Roblox, where what it turns out is that actually, right, who's on Roblox? It's minors and groomers, right? And it's going to keep happening like that, right? Is that the minors that want access to this content are going to stop having safe places where they can access it without interacting with actual adults immediately, right? And are going to end up effectively in conversations with the adults who do not care that the person they're talking to on the other end is a minor or prefer that, right? That's what's going to happen. That's how this works, right? Because yeah, it turns out, right, if the internet loses all usable places for minors to exist, as minors reasonably safely, right? You know, things like Club Penguin and the like, which are quite heavily moderated because there are spaces literally for children, right, and for minors, and they're, you know, and are policed as such, and you make it a homogenous place where you expect minors and adults all to exist, right? And then you also remove adult access to more adult spaces. What happens is minors and adults have to end up existing exclusively together on the internet, which ends up with minors in adult conversations with minors. Because of course it does, right? Because the minors are not in a space where they can filter, you know, right? It doesn't work. It's just making things more dangerous. And I don't understand how anyone that claims to want to protect children can possibly justify that. Well, okay, I can, but it's not actually protecting children. Okay, if you actually want to protect children, you should be opposed to these changes. All of them, right? Because they are not going to work to protect children, they are just going to make everyone's lives more dangerous.
This System signing out. Hope to catch you all next week. Please do remember to like, subscribe, comment, especially if you've got any questions you want answered. Be happy to answer them either in the comments or in another video. So catch you all next week.